My name is Philomena and I am a member of the Cho family. I came to Barbados from Trinidad late 1966, and I also completed my high school sixth form in Barbados at Queen's College. So my dad, we had an opportunity to visit his village, and it's Feng Shui in the Bayun district. It's only about 15 minutes from the current Guangzhou airport, and the village still has, most of the people there are named Cho. I also had the opportunity to visit my mother's village, and her father is from Sun Tuk, which is also in Guangdong, but it's further away from the airport and it's closer to Shenzhen. That my father his village was primarily into agriculture, whereas my mom's village, they apparently grew silkworms. So their village was very involved in growing silkworms. They had a lot of mulberry trees, and so that's where they used to spin silk. Having seen both villages, what is very clear to me, you could see the difference, because in my dad's village, the area is much more agricultural, whereas now my mom's village, which is Sun Tuk, it seems to be much more developed, and they have a lot more, I wouldn't say, it's not so much agriculture anymore, but there's furniture, manufacturing, and other types of industries like that. My dad's father, my grandfather, he apparently came from Guangdong to Guyana. Not quite clear exactly what was the reason, but I presume that it's probably the same as most of the Chinese who were looking for opportunities to do better economically, because during those times my impression was that China, there was a lot of internal tribal warfare, right? And many of the folks had a difficult time economically. So I think my grandfather must have come from China looking for improved economic circumstances. Now, he came to Guyana, and based on what I've heard, after he came and he liked the West Indies, he went back to China and he brought my dad and his younger brother to the Caribbean, Guyana and then Trinidad. In the case of my mom, her father came from China, set up business in Trinidad. He had a Chinese wife, and he then subsequently married my grandmother in Trinidad, who also came from a Chinese family. He died when my mom was a year old, and the Chinese in Trinidad sent my grandmother and my mother back to China. Well, not back to, because she was never there, but sent her to China to grow up, be educated and grow up. So she went to China when she was 1 year old. So I can't imagine what it must have been like, because my poor grandmother didn't speak Chinese as far as I understood it. And my mom was 1 year old. So she went to China and had to learn the language and settle in with relatives she had never met before. But it seems, based on my interactions with cousins that we have connected with, that they were made very welcome, and they had a pretty good life in terms of the fact that because my grandmother had been educated in an English-speaking country, they moved between China and Hong Kong. So my mother, in her school life, boarded in the convent in Hong Kong. Now, they were there up until the World War II, and so they saw many of the challenges of living in China, and then what happened to both China and Hong Kong when the Japanese were invading. So basically what my grandmother told me is that she had a brother and a sister, because she came from a large family. She had a brother and a sister who were the same mother and father, Chinese mother, Chinese father. Then her father subsequently married a Trinidadian Spanish lady, and he had about 10 more kids. So she came from an extremely large family, right? So when the World War occurred, what I understand is they said to her, "Why are you staying over there? Come back to Trinidad." So they encouraged her, and so in 1947 they took the decision to remigrate from China back to the Caribbean. I think my dad would have come to the Caribbean somewhere around early 40s. I'm not able to define the exact time, because when I went back to China in 2015, I asked the older folks what happened. And all they said to me is that his father, after the Japanese had invaded China, and my dad was one of 5, 4 boys and 1 girl. And apparently the 2 younger boys got killed during the Japanese War. So my grandfather decided he wasn't losing any more kids. So that's when he came back and got the 2 boys and brought them to the Caribbean. So that's really the story behind it. I already told you about my mom, right? So based on what has been said, we believe that my dad would have come here around 1940. Yeah, and my mom came in 47, going on to 48. And so I assume that somewhere in Trinidad they met. I'm one of 6, and all of us were given Chinese names. So my Chinese name in Cantonese is Cho Choyong, and in Mandarin it's Chu Fei, something like that. Yeah, I can't. In Mandarin is not as familiar to me, but I know the Cantonese version. Actually, I learned Cantonese before I learned English, because my parents obviously spoke Chinese. The only person who did some English was my grandmother, right? So obviously, what happened though is that, unfortunately, in hindsight, when I was about 8 or 9, I stopped speaking Chinese because I was in school in Trinidad, and Chinese, although they had a fair number of Chinese, they still thought of Chinese people as being different. Right, so I started to speak Chinese. My mom told me I started to speak Chinese at school, and the kids made fun of me, and I came home crying. And after that time, basically I didn't speak Chinese, so I listened to the Chinese and I would speak back to them in English. So as a result of that, I'm not as conversant as I ought to be. The good thing though is, and perhaps this is the benefit of teaching kids young, what I found is that when I went back to China and when I went to Guangzhou, within a week it started to come back. So I found that I was able to understand much more of what my family in China was saying to me. Because of course, it's difficult because most of them don't speak English. In particular, my dad has a half-brother still alive in China. Because his dad went back to China, got married again, and so had a last son. And, so he said to me, "I don't speak good English." So I said, "Well, okay, speak to me and I will see if I can understand you." And it became much more, I much more understood it. And then I got the courage to respond to some extent in the Cantonese. True friends was primarily within the Chinese community. However, luckily for me, at school, since I started school there at a young age, and then in particular when I went to high school in St. Joseph Convent in San Fernando, and there were quite a number of persons who lived close by, and in those days we used to walk to school in the morning, walk home for lunch, and walk back after lunch and walk home in the evening. So it was about a mile away. So there were two friends in particular who I still remain very friendly with. They're one of my best friends. And so we together, we would do the morning walk. Like I was further up the road, so when I walk along, I'd stop and pick her up. We would go to school, then lunchtime, come back to lunch, go home, right? Go back to school, then we were in the afternoon. So we had a lot of opportunity to bond. So from that perspective, I think we weren't mainstream in being recognized as Trinidadians per se, but we were pretty much accepted. So I didn't have a challenge at school because the school, in Trinidad, the environment was very mixed. You had all types of people. And to me, nationality wasn't a problem at that point in time. It's just as I've said to you, you were scarred when at a young age people didn't understand why you were speaking other languages. Because in those days, I think in the Caribbean, learning a language was not as important. So people kind of only expected you to speak English or Trinidadian dialect. When I moved to Barbados, I was 15 going on 16. And the things that happened in Trinidad happened again in Barbados. Yeah, because my family lived in St. Matthias, near Harts Gap, Christchurch, and we had, the folks nearby were pretty friendly because my father ran the shop in the area, my dad and mom, and and so folks who used to come to the shop, they were okay, no problem. But the peculiar thing I remembered is that when I first came to Barbados, I couldn't understand Barbadian dialect, right? Because I remember even in Trinidad, when Barbadians came, we had a rough time to understand what they were saying. When it came to Barbados, the village folks, it was a bit of a challenge. However, this is the peculiar thing. When I went to school, I don't know if it is because they didn't speak dialect, but I was able to understand my counterparts at school. So eventually, probably after about 6 months or so, I got much better at understanding, and I also worked in the shop and used to have to serve, right? So you knew the basics. The two main ones that we always celebrated was Chinese New Year and Mooncake, Mid-Autumn Festival. Well, it's only later I understood it was called Mid-Autumn Festival because when I was young, it was the Mooncake Festival, right, where they had these specially made cakes out of things like lotus paste and all that, and eggs in the middle. So in Trinidad has quite a lot more Chinese than Barbados. So the Chinese community, we got together. We had folks who were also of the same village as my dad. So we used to go and get together with them, and they had kids, and we would all celebrate Chinese New Year. The other thing I remember in Trinidad is that because of the size of the community, the Chinese Association used to bring down Chinese opera and a number of other cultural shows. So we couldn't understand so much, but we went and we enjoyed it. Because my parents would obviously be wanting to see it. So we would go, we would all be taken, because that's one thing with Chinese. I find that Chinese people always included the entire family whenever they went to get-togethers. So even if the kids didn't quite understand, you all went along, and then we would play with the other kids, and the parents would enjoy themselves. Yeah, well, Chinese New Year has always been, especially for the kids, right? They used to get the red envelopes, which they always look forward to. Because in Chinese New Year, all the children got red envelopes as gifts. My kids in particular I consider relatively lucky because I'm married to a Jamaican Chinese, half Chinese, and so in Jamaica there are a lot more Chinese, and so they grew up with those type of traditions, and in Jamaica the celebrations were much bigger.